Title: The Horror Story of My Cousin Taking Care of a Harvest in Abandoned Lands. Good evening, community. My name is Americo, and I want to share with you an experience that happened to me several years ago during my youth. I have always been a man of the countryside, surrounded by plants and animals. I lived on a ranch in my early childhood, then in a small town, and now I reside in the southern mountains of Mexico. My children often urge me to move to the city, but honestly, I am happy here. This is my reality, everything I know. My family has always been close-knit, with its ups and downs, like any other family. One of the people closest to me is my cousin Celso. He plays a significant role in this story, as he invited me to help him take care of his crop in the mountains. I cannot provide many details about what he was growing, but let's just call it green cotton for now. As the story unfolds, you will have a clearer idea of what it was, but I believe you can already imagine it. The plantation was hidden, located about 5 hours away from the nearest ranch, which happened to be my uncle's, Celso's father. At that time, my cousin was 23 years old, and I was 21. One day, Celso came to my parents' house in the town. He invited me to get in his truck, and we went for a ride. "I need your help, cousin," he said while driving. He began explaining that he had a job for me, but I had to go with him for a few days. "I want you to help me take care of a crop I have in the mountains, the green cotton I told you about," he said. Celso confessed that his friend, who was originally working with him, had let him down. He needed someone to lend him a hand because it was too much for him alone. From what Celso had told me so far, I knew I had to go to the mountains, and we could be away for up to 3 days. It wasn't the first time he harvested green cotton, and each time the plantation was further away. He couldn't do it in the same place due to the risk of being discovered. Initially, he worked with his brother, but he had gone to the United States several months ago. This was the first harvest without him. I didn't know if I should accept. The idea of living in the mountains for several days didn't appeal to me, let alone sleeping in the middle of nowhere. I was afraid. Celso tried to convince me, saying that we could earn good money together. I suggested the name of another acquaintance who was a friend to both of us, but we knew we couldn't trust just anyone for the job. I didn't have much time to think, so that same evening, I told him that I would go with him to take care of the crop. When I arrived home and told my parents that I would be going with my cousin, my mother found it strange. Suddenly, I announced that I would visit my aunt and uncle. She didn't like the idea and kept asking me what I was going to do and why I had made this decision so suddenly. There was something she didn't like, and I could see it on her face. I packed a backpack with 3 changes of clothes and assured her that there was nothing to worry about, that it would only be a few days. My father approached me and kindly asked me not to get into trouble. He knew about Celso's plantation, and I'm sure he suspected that I would be working with him. "Take care, son. You're old enough to know what is right and wrong. But it's up to you," my worried father said. I lied and mentioned that I just wanted to spend a few days with my aunt and uncle, that I missed the mountains and the countryside. Besides, I had done it in the past, so there was nothing to worry about. I reassured him. By 5 p.m., we were already arriving at my cousin's property. Celso explained the plan during the journey. The harvest was already underway. We just had to wait a little longer to start picking and, most importantly, ensure that everything was in order. We didn't spend much time at my uncle's ranch, only one night. The next morning, very early, we set off on our way through the hills. My uncle asked us to be careful, and my aunt gave us her blessing. I was nervous. We had brought enough food for the next 3 days, and then we would return for more supplies. Celso told me that it would take approximately 5 hours of walking. The path was not straight. In fact, it was quite the opposite. We had to move from side to side, up and down the hills. It was exhausting. During the journey, my cousin told me about the difficulties he had faced during this particular harvest, even more so than the previous ones. The plantation was much further away from the ranch, but it had to be that way for the safety of his family and the land where he was cultivating. I asked him who owned the land, and there was silence. Then Celso replied that a friend had lent it to him. "Your friend who didn't want to work with you anymore?" I jokingly questioned. "Yes, that's the one," my cousin replied, catching his breath as we climbed a hill. After what felt like an eternity, we finally arrived at the location. The land was vast and had to be exposed to the sun throughout the day, so it was surrounded by trees. It was filled with green cotton, and the typical smell of the plantation reached my nose. Right next to it, there was a small hammock hanging between the trees, some farming tools, and kitchen utensils. Celso began checking that everything was in order. He had been away for a long time, and there was a risk that an animal or even a person had approached. I dismissed the latter possibility. It seemed like we were far away from everything. There weren't even any fences marking the boundaries of the hectares. Obviously, there were no people around. Celso pointed out that there was a river a few meters away if I needed to use the bathroom. The area was surrounded by trees. Night fell, and my cousin offered me to sleep in the hammock. There was only one, so he would sleep near a tree on a makeshift bed. The place was eerily silent, and I could even hear the distant sound of the river flowing downhill. That first night, I had a hard time falling asleep. I tossed and turned, my gaze wandering through the shadows formed by the trees. The only light illuminating us came from the stars. We couldn't make a fire or anything that would give away our location. We had to be cautious. In front of me, about 10 meters away, Celso lay near the tree. It seemed like he was already asleep. It was my turn to keep watch. We took turns every 4 hours. My cousin had explained that I didn't need to stand the whole time. The idea was simply not to fall asleep and to take a walk from time to time. I got out of the hammock and started walking. At first, I moved slowly, as if my footsteps were the only sound breaking the silence, apart from Celso's breathing, which gradually faded away. I had only advanced a few meters when I heard a sound in the distance. It was like a faint lament. I stopped, trying not to move. The sound was carried by the wind, a combination of an animal and a human. It's hard to explain exactly. Slowly, it began to move closer. What was strange was that it was the only sound I could hear. Not even the branches or footsteps made any noise. Just the faint, quiet crying. It was getting closer, and I had a strange sensation in my body. Goosebumps covered my skin. Something started to rise from the pit of my stomach. Suddenly, the sound became louder, as if it were only a few meters away. I turned my head in that direction. The trees in front of me were consumed by the shadows of the night. Even the branches seemed motionless. I turned around, trying to remain calm. I had to warn Celso. I retraced my steps, and as I did, I noticed something moving in the plantation. It was a shadow, seemingly a person. The figure was thin, walking near the plants. Judging by its position, it seemed to have its face turned towards me. I quickened my pace, and the figure continued to walk behind me, moving effortlessly despite the terrain. I crouched down, trying not to be seen. I reached my cousin's makeshift bed and woke him up. "I think there's someone in the crop," I whispered. Celso reacted quickly, telling me to follow him. We both hid among the trees, staying quiet and still. We kept a close watch, but there was no one to be found. We stayed hidden for a while, both of us on high alert, but nothing happened. Whispering, I told Celso that I had heard someone crying. The sound came from between the trees. Then I explained about the shadow. He asked if I was sure it was a person, and I replied that I couldn't confirm it, but the figure I saw seemed human. The next day, I took the opportunity to explore the surroundings. The idea was for one of us to stay and watch over the crop while the other checked the surrounding areas. We had to be attentive to the sound of any helicopters or planes. That was also important. Celso told me not to wander too far and to try to cover as much territory as possible. I walked in the opposite direction of the river, downhill. In front of me, there were only trees, and the daylight filtered through the leaves. In the distance, I could make out what seemed to be a house. This caught my attention because I didn't know there were people nearby. I thought the place was abandoned. The property was falling apart, and it seemed like no one had lived there for years. The house was well hidden, and something else that caught my attention was that it seemed to have been burned. I was a few meters away from it when I noticed that the walls and roof were stained black. Nature had slowly reclaimed its territory, with plants growing on the walls and even inside. The place felt uncomfortable, and the darkness inside was even more intense than outside. The little light that filtered through the holes in the roof was dim. There wasn't even a path or anything guiding me to it. It was hidden among the trees, as if they didn't want it to be found. Another thing that caught my attention was the smell of burning, still lingering. It seemed like the house had been recently burned. It smelled like charred flesh. I cautiously entered the house, not intending to stay. As I got closer, I noticed a light coming from inside, as if someone had lit a candle. I approached, but I had no intention of going in. From a few meters away, I could see someone standing at the back. It seemed to be the same silhouette in the white dress that I had been following earlier. The hallway looked longer than the last time I was there, as if the house had grown. I tried to speak to her again, but there was no response. In a way, my body went into alert mode. All my senses heightened, screaming at me that I shouldn't be there. I stepped back slightly, feeling the need to get away. That thing inside the house didn't move. The candlelight illuminated her white dress, but I still couldn't see her face. However, from what I could perceive, the silhouette was much larger than when we were among the trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the feeling of discomfort intensified, causing a stabbing pain in my stomach. The woman at the end of the hallway started to approach, moving slowly. There was something about her movement that I didn't like. It was strange. I stepped back, and as she reached the entrance, the remaining daylight touched her arms. At that moment, my heart almost jumped out of my chest. Her hands and arms appeared burned. I was only a few meters away from the house, and that woman peered out. Her face was completely disfigured, black as coal. My legs began to tremble, and I felt a terrible weight in my chest. I wanted to run, but my mind couldn't communicate with my body. I was frozen. That thing from inside the house didn't move. The candlelight illuminated her white dress, but I still couldn't see her face. However, from what I could perceive, the silhouette was much larger than when we were among the trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the feeling of discomfort intensified, causing a stabbing pain in my stomach. The woman at the end of the hallway started to approach, moving slowly. There was something about her movement that I didn't like. It was strange. I stepped back, and as she reached the entrance, the remaining daylight touched her arms. At that moment, my heart almost jumped out of my chest. Her hands and arms appeared burned. I was only a few meters away from the house, and that woman peered out. Her face was completely disfigured, black as coal. My legs began to tremble, and I felt a terrible weight in my chest. I wanted to run, but my mind couldn't communicate with my body. I was frozen. That thing from inside the house didn't move. The candlelight illuminated her white dress, but I still couldn't see her face. However, from what I could perceive, the silhouette was much larger than when we were among the trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the feeling of discomfort intensified, causing a stabbing pain in my stomach. I wanted to run, but my mind couldn't communicate with my body. I was frozen. That thing from inside the house didn't move. The candlelight illuminated her white dress, but I still couldn't see her face. However, from what I could perceive, the silhouette was much larger than when we were among the trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the feeling of discomfort intensified, causing a My Cousin Takes Care of a Harvest in Abandoned Lands horror story of the countryside and villages. I felt a burning sensation crawling up my back. I started screaming like a madman, tearing my throat apart, but I didn't care. My lungs were running out of air, but I kept on screaming. The pain was unbearable. I had never felt anything like it in my life. It was a horrible sensation that I wanted to avoid at all costs. I can't even begin to describe my desperation. All my senses were overwhelmed by the screams of that thing, the strong smell of burning, and the horrible sensation against my skin. I couldn't handle it all. I was going crazy. I threw myself to the ground and started trembling uncontrollably. I cried like a child. Suddenly, I felt hands on my shoulders. In the midst of so much suffering, I started defending myself. I recognized the voice of a man. I opened my eyes, and in the darkness, I could see my cousin. I didn't understand what was happening. The man was also crying, terrified. He grabbed my hands and prevented me from hitting in. I don't remember exactly what he was saying to me. All I wanted was to get out of there as soon as possible. I'm sure my screams could be heard for miles around. My throat hurt so much. I kept asking for help until everything turned black and I knew no more. I don't remember what happened next. I only remember the fear I felt and how much my legs hurt. Suddenly, I woke up, but I didn't know where I was. I only saw trees and my body swaying. My cousin's voice echoed in my head, but I didn't understand what he was saying. I was so tired that I couldn't even speak. Everything hurt. When I regained consciousness, I was in a hospital. My mother was sleeping by my side. When she heard my voice, she became alarmed. She was very happy that I had woken up, but I felt a horrible pain. My legs were burning and bandaged. I didn't understand why. I felt terrible stabs in the soles of my feet. I tried to remove the bandages, but my mom wouldn't let me. Nervously, she told me that I had injured my legs. I didn't know how to react. She said I had burns all over, and the soles of my feet were black as if I had stepped on burning coal. Tears filled my eyes. My mother explained that Celso had brought me to the hospital. According to him, he found me in the forest, screaming like a madman. My mother sounded angry, as if she didn't believe what my cousin had told her. The memories started coming back. Me running through the trees, the horrible pain in my body, that terrifying creature with a deformed face crying behind me. A chill ran through me. I was breathless. Then I started crying. I didn't understand what had happened, and anguish completely overwhelmed me. That same afternoon, when I talked to Celso, he was very worried. It had been almost a week since they found me. My cousin couldn't believe I was awake. I could hear his voice breaking as he told me what had happened. He was near the crops and noticed I was missing. He started looking for me, but couldn't find me. Hours passed, and there was no trace of me. He shouted my name everywhere. Night fell, and by then, he was already thinking that maybe I had returned to the ranch. However, he wasn't convinced. He still believed I was somewhere nearby. There was no reason for me to have left without saying anything. He searched for me again, but the darkness prevented him from seeing clearly. That morning, he heard screams that woke him up abruptly. It was me? I was agonizing a few meters from the crops. He found me on the ground, crying and screaming like a madman. He tried to approach me, but I wouldn't let him. I hit him uncontrollably. He did his best to calm me down, and then I passed out. He saw my injured legs. The injuries weren't as serious on the upper part, but they were severe on my feet. Celso thought the worst. He believed someone had caused me harm. He carried me on his shoulders and hurried to his parents' ranch. He was terrified and didn't know what was happening. What my cousin told me left me shocked. According to him, I had been missing for over 12 hours, but that wasn't possible. Only minutes had passed. I was sure of it. Everything that happened afterwards was too much information to process. My family didn't believe me or my cousin. What we were telling them sounded impossible. The things that occurred were beyond belief. One spent a few more days in the hospital. When I was alone with my cousin, I asked him the same question. What was that woman? She couldn't be human. She was something terrifying. Her deformed face haunted me every day. I couldn't get it out of my head. Celso had always been there for me. He felt guilty for what had happened. I won't deny that I was initially angry with him, but then I understood that what had occurred was beyond our control. One afternoon, several days after leaving the hospital, Celso was at home. We met in the yard, and he confessed that he had also seen something strange by the river just before I went missing. There was a woman washing her hands. He couldn't see her face, but she was dressed in white. He watched her for a while, but she didn't do anything else. She just stayed bent over near the water. When she finally stood up and walked among the trees, my cousin followed her. However, it didn't take long for him to lose sight of her. It was as if she had simply vanished. He regretted not taking me away from there earlier, and especially for forcing me to stay with him. I reassured him that no one had forced me to do anything, and it wasn't his fault. Fortunately, we were both okay, and that was what mattered. Celso later confirmed that the harvest was lost, but that was the least of our concerns. He never went back to that place. He thought about it many times, but felt it wasn't worth it. I think this was one of the greatest mysteries that has surrounded my family. We still can't explain what happened that afternoon, nor do we know what that being wanted exactly. I still can't erase from my mind that thing that followed me to this day. I have nightmares that torment me on unexpected nights.